Oh, wow. Don't even say a word and I'm getting cheers, man. Good morning, you guys. Morning, Open Door. I get the distinct privilege of getting to walk us in another encounter with Jesus in this series, and I'm beyond excited and humbled and honored. The last time I was up here, I got to introduce you guys a little bit. If you were here, I got to see it online. I know there's millions of YouTube views on those videos, but if you got to see it online, I got to introduce you to my family a little bit, and I'm going to embarrass a couple of them right now. First, my mom, it's her birthday today, so if you see her, she's right in the middle right there. So tell her happy birthday if you see her. My brother, I got to introduce you to my brother, my younger brother, who was here in first hour, and I got to introduce you to my girlfriend, Emily. And what a few people in the room knew, and I knew, but not everyone knew, was that I had plans to propose to Emily within the month after speaking. And so that all went down July 16th. And so I had this big elaborate plan laid out. It's a scavenger hunt that I was going to have her go on. And so she and I would drive up to Payson and Mogollon Rim area, actually right around where MMR, where we're going to do fellowship weekend is. But we're driving up. And I have to figure out a way. Basically, I have friends, different groups of friends stationed at different locations around Payson and then along the rim. So I've got like 15 or 20 friends scattered at these different places. So we're going to drive up, and the plan is to ditch her. I'm going to ditch her when we get there. And then my friends are going to it sounds terrible when I say it. They're going to kidnap her and take her to these different locations. And so basically at each location, there'll be 4 or 5 friends. They give her a letter that breaks down a different stage of our relationship. We've dated for 3.5 years, so I've got a lot that I can kind of reminisce on in those letters. And so they give her a letter, and then they blindfold her and take her to the next location where other friends are, and she'll read another letter, and that just keeps going throughout the rest of that afternoon, and then she gets to me on this beautiful overlook at the Mogollon Rim. And so I don't ever do this. I made a crucial mistake of hinging my moving away from her when we get there on my acting ability, which is fairly non-existent. So if you're not an actor, don't do what I did, but this is kind of how it went down. So we're driving up, and I have to figure out how to ditch her. I have to figure out how to get rid of her so that I can get away and get to my spot. So we're arriving at Bash's. I know she's going to have to use the bathroom when we get up there after driving. So she's going to use the bathroom, and then I'm going to tell her, no, I'm good, I don't have to use the bathroom. And then my plan is that she'll come out, and I'll say, you know what, no, I probably should, but could you grab me like a drink in the coolers in the back, and then I'll just meet you at the front. And so I was like, yeah, she'd buy that. I like special drinks and that sort of thing, so she'll take that. It'll work. So we get up there. It's all going according to plan. Text my friends. They're all in place. And she goes to the bathroom, comes out. Game time for stage right for Clint. So I roll in, and I kind of, those moments where you power through things and just hope it works? That's kind of what I was doing. Those moments where you're thinking you're picking things up and you don't ever pick it up, but you keep trying. That's what I was doing. So I just power through, and I'm I think I am going to go to the bathroom real quick because I don't know when we're going to see our friends and when the next bathroom will be available. But could you grab me a drink? And I didn't even say where to grab me a drink. I didn't say, I didn't give her any direction. She's like, I'll just wait for you. And I was like, oh, shoot. So she returned serve. I didn't expect her. I thought I was going to ace. She returned serve. And I'm like, so I kind of backtracked my way out of it when I was like, no, I think there's a drink at the back of the store that you'll know that I like and that you should grab for me, and I'll meet you at the front. And then back out, awkwardly out of the conversation. And she's like, okay. And so she goes to the back of the store, but it worked. It worked, thankfully. So I go to the bathroom got out. And so I sneak around, make sure she's not looking, and get to my spot. And then the whole process goes through, and it's a blast, and everybody is there with her in it, all our friends. And we get up to the rim and have this beautiful overlook, and I propose. She gave me a firm maybe, so we're making progress in our relationship. No, in all seriousness, she said yes. So we now get to step into this next stage of engaged life together, and we are excited and filled with joy and anxious and nervous and everything that comes with that. So if you guys see us and want to give us advice, you want to say, no, don't do it, it's not worth it, so we can back out now. Or on the other side, if you guys want to build us up and affirm us in that, we're so excited and want to continue to be immersed in this community in the midst of this new stage for us. So that has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about the rest of the morning, but I kind of wanted to brag, so I'm engaged. I'm calling Emily fiance as much as possible too, like more than her actual name, because I want to embrace it. But I'm going to pray real quick, and then we're going to jump right in to another encounter we get with Jesus. So if you guys want to bow your heads. Dear Father, thank you for sending your Son. Thank you for giving us glimpses and having them be written down so that thousands of years later we can see more about your character. And we can see what that does in our lives for us today. God, I want to pray that your Spirit moves through these words and moves through me, and most importantly, moves in the minds and the hearts of the people in this room. I want to pray all those things in your name. Amen. If you guys want to open up your Bibles or Bible apps or whatever the kids are using these days, we're going to be Matthew 26, 36 through 46. That's where we're going to be. So you guys can open up there. We're looking at Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane. And this series, if you guys haven't been here for this series yet, or if you have, I'll just remind you, this series has been all about immersing ourselves in the character of Jesus as he's revealed in gospel narratives. So we're looking at stories in Jesus' life where we can place ourselves into it. But in the midst of that, there is this necessity to look at the contexts surrounding the events so that we can better become fully enveloped in it. And so here it's the same thing. And so it's important to know where the disciples and Jesus are coming from when they arrive at Gethsemane. The disciples and Jesus have just spent time in the upper room sharing the Last Supper together. And they have had this safe, four-walled, tender, intimate environment to interact with Jesus. And so the beauty of that moment is clearly evident there. And that's in the midst of a city in turmoil. Jerusalem at the time hated Jesus for the most part because of the religious leaders, and thus they felt this conflict throughout his ministry wherever they went. I mean, Jesus came into Jerusalem and he flipped tables less than a week before this. He angered the people in power because he was asserting a new type of power. So there's this sense outside of this room, people don't like these guys. They want them dead or gone. And so this tender, intimate environment that they get is super special to these disciples because it gives them an escape from that conflict. And in the midst of that, there's also this simultaneous emotional conflict in each of the disciples because Jesus starts talking about things in the upper room they're not really sure about. Like it gives them some anxiety a little bit. Like, for instance, Jesus talks about who's going to betray him. So in the middle of their dinner, they're laughing, their community together, Jesus says, yeah, one of you in this room is going to betray me. And so the disciples immediately jump to their mind fluttering back and forth about who it's going to be. Oh, it's obviously going to be Peter. He's the one who walked on the water. He looked at Jesus, and then he took his eyes off. He clearly doesn't have faith. It's going to be Peter. It's going to be Matthew. He's the tax collector. He's the one that loves the money. He's going to turn him in for money. Duh. Some of them are probably even thinking, I need to do everything I can to make sure it's not me. They're watching every step so carefully from this point on. And that emotional conflict continues after they leave the room. They go to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus did a lot of his ministry and teaching. And there, Jesus says that, Peter, you're going to deny me. And Peter denies that he's going to deny him, which we're all like, silly Peter, we know what happens after this. And all the disciples affirm the same thing. They won't deny Jesus. But at the same time, there's this sense of, I don't know what the next minute holds. Like Jesus is saying all this stuff, and I don't know how it's all going to go down. So the disciples have this conflict of emotional anxiety, unsureness, and then a beautiful dinner with Jesus. And that's where we're at going into Gethsemane here. So I'm going to read this passage out loud if you guys want to follow along. Again, it's Matthew 26, 36 through 46. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. And so again, in that theme of context, there's a couple things before Jesus even says a word in Gethsemane that are crucial to our understanding of the mentality here. And the first one of those is that Jesus goes to Gethsemane knowing full well that this is where the disciples are going to know he's going to be. See, Jesus went here repeatedly to pray and reflect and spend time with his Father. And the disciples knew that, which means Judas knew that. See, Jesus knows that he will get betrayed here in this tender place where he spends so much time seeking his Father. And so he doesn't go there to flee. He doesn't go there to hide. He doesn't go there to get away. He goes there and instead sets a tone of obedience that carries through the rest of the passage. The second thing that's significant about Gethsemane here is the actual name. Gethsemane was not original to the garden. A Gethsemane was an actual thing. It's actually a combination of two Hebrew words, and it means oil press or olive press, and it actually is a tool that was used. So I got a couple pictures here because they're still used in Israel sometimes today. It's kind of what it looks like. There's a couple other pictures and then a little graph I want to show you guys about how it works. Yeah, so right here, you've got that long log across the top, and it's anchored into the wall. And on the left, you've got these rocks that are tied to it by ropes, and so those rocks are used as weights. And there in the middle, you've got this pretty heavy stone pressing down on this basket that's full to the brim with olives. And so you would basically use that rod as a lever to press, create immense pressure to produce olive oil. So you've got this beautiful picture of immense pressure being used to create something beautiful and beneficial. And so we have Jesus entering into his own literal and spiritual Gethsemane. And he invites his disciples into how this makes him feel and what it's bringing up in him. He says in verse 38, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. I think Jesus' godhood and our emphasis on Jesus' godhood sometimes makes us miss his full and complete humanity. See, his godhood is essential, and we need to know that, and it's on full glorious display soon enough in this narrative, and we wouldn't be sitting here without it. But there's also this sense of him being 100% human. And we get it throughout the gospel narratives. I mean, he was tired on the boat in the storm in Mark. He cried and grieved with Lazarus' family right before he raised Lazarus from the dead. Jesus was fully immersed in this human experience. And right now, in this moment, he says that sorrow, that human experience wells up to the point where he feels like he could die. He feels this immense weight and pressure for all the evil of all time. From the beginning of humanity to the end of humanity, every single wrongdoing is setting in on Jesus' shoulders. Think of the most heinous evil act that you can. He's dying for that. Jesus feels the weight of this decision. And it's not just a factual knowledge, it's an experiential knowledge. Now, I'm going to use this word pressure throughout the rest of the morning to kind of encompass a lot of different aspects. And so I want to make clear what I mean when I say pressure the rest of the time. Pressure, when I say that, is basically the emotional workings within our human experience of this life. So grief, pain, distress, despair, loneliness, all of those things fall under pressure. And so Jesus here is feeling pressure of all mankind of all time. He's feeling a pressure that outweighs everyone ever. And he's experiencing that. Now, that idea of factual experience versus experiential knowing, there's a pretty big difference there. And I think we all know it. I experienced it actually. I went to the UK for a mission trip a couple years ago with my college, GCU. Lopes up. And I went there, and I found this out beforehand. It's kind of a cool fact. So if You guys want to take this away and share it in those like trivia contests that you go to. I don't know if you go there, but I'm assuming you do. Wales has more castles per capita than any other country in the world. The small little area in the UK has more castle fortified areas than anywhere else in the world. And so I knew going into this mission trip, we'd be spending 8 days in Wales. I knew I'm probably going to see some castles there. Factually, in my head, I knew I'd be seeing some castles in Wales. And then I get there, and I get to stand in the middle of this castle from like the 10th or 11th century that's worn down and weather-beaten. And I get to point to areas in the castle, and I experience it. I say, that's where the dungeon was. Like, that's a thing. That's not just in fairy tales. Like, a dungeon was there. Or this is where they ate dinner. This is the dining hall. That's where they kept the horses. And I get to build up in my mind this castle that the factual knowledge didn't do for me. See, experiencing it, being there, increases our knowledge of it in our heads. And Jesus, right here, is feeling that. He factually knew he'd have to die for everyone, but now he feels the weight, the pressure of this. And it results in what the next verse tells us. He fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Complete experiential agony throws Jesus to the ground, and humility and obedience keeps him there. Jesus goes straight to his face in agony. Luke's gospel tells us that he literally had sweat like blood pouring from his body. Pressure is crushing him to the point where he is face down in the garden. And Jesus' response in the midst of this is so significant. He feels the full weight of what this choice means. And in the midst of that pressure, he's feeling temptation. Just like we can in our lives, pressure puts us in an emotional state where temptation can get a foothold. And so he's feeling a temptation to say, God, I can't. I can't go through with your will right now. He's feeling a temptation to say, this weight, Father, is too much. It's too much for me to bear. And so that temptation creeps in, and it's Jesus' twofold response here that's so significant to this story. His first part of the response is that he brings himself fully and unabashedly into the presence of his Father. What he doesn't do is go to his Father and say, "Oh, God, I'm just not feeling so hot right now, but I know you got my back. We're good to go," and then leave. He doesn't go to God out of anger and say, "Why would you do this to me?" No, he instead goes to his Father and says, "This weight, it's so heavy, Dad. It's so heavy. Yet, in the midst of it, I desire your will. I know the weight that I have to carry, and it's full in there. And if there's any way that your will can be done without it, let it be done. But God, I desire your will in the midst of this pressure. I'm in pain and agony over this, but I desire to see your will and character glorified above all else. I want you to know where I am and know that in the midst of it, I desire your will." And so Jesus immediately gives us this template for what pressure does, how it links with temptation, and how to respond. And then he goes back to his disciples, who he gave one job. Watch. Like, if he gets caught alone right here, he probably could be dead. Like, people want him killed. They're just the lookouts. Like, all you got to do is stay awake. And naturally, the disciples can't. And so Jesus comes back to them, and he gives them a directive for what he's literally practicing alone in the garden. He says in verse 41, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Now notice what Jesus doesn't say there. He doesn't go to the disciples and say, "Do better, you guys. You're better than this. Do better." He doesn't go to the disciples and say, "I'm just so disappointed in you guys. You had so much potential." He doesn't go to the disciples and say, "Try harder. You got it, just try harder." No, he goes to the disciples and he actually removes their physical ability from the equation at all. And he says, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation." He says, this isn't about you because you can't do it in your own physical ability. So watch and pray that the Father can strengthen you to combat temptation. Bring yourself fully into God's presence and let Him strengthen you. It's not about your physical ability. It never will be and it never has been. It's instead about trusting in the strength that God can give you in the midst of your pressure and temptation. And Jesus is literally practicing it right here in the garden. See, in this moment, He gives us a glimpse into the complete trust in the heart of God and what it does to our ability to resist temptation. And He tells us that the life of the Christian is less about cautiously avoiding darkness and is far more about being so unified with the heart of Christ that darkness isn't even dwelled on. The life of the Christian is less about cautiously avoiding darkness and is far more about being so unified with Christ that darkness isn't even dwelled on. That's what this is about. And Christ shows us that right here. And He leaves His disciples and He goes back. And He prays a couple more times. So He prays and He comes back. They're still sleeping, so He goes back and prays again. He is the epitome of loneliness. First of all, His closest friends are sleeping through His agony right now. But more than that, Jesus also gives us a glimpse into the fact that this isn't a flip of a switch type of thing. This isn't something where you bring your pressure fully to God and all of a sudden it's fixed with a snap of a finger. And it's not as if you pray hard enough on your face that all of a sudden it's fixed. No, Jesus has to continuously and intentionally go back to His Father in the midst of His pressure, in the midst of the agony that He feels. He says, God, I need you in the midst of this, and I will come back to you and come back to you and come back to you. And the result of that is Jesus meeting God in His obedience. And so He comes back to the disciples, and He says this, "See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." He wrestles with God in His pressure. He brings Himself fully exposed, sweating blood to His Father, and He chooses to obey. It wasn't like Jesus was a puppet here, and this was all just part of this puppeteer's master plan. He had to choose it in the midst of His pressure in humanity. John 18:10, Jesus even alludes to this in His ministry. "No one takes it, my life, from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father." He chose it. He chooses to obey, to align Himself with the will of God because He knows the love that is produced and is at the heart of all of that. So what does it do? What does Jesus' obedience in that garden do? And in order to answer that question, we got to flash back. Got to flash back to a different garden, the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were created in perfect unity with the Father. And they are completely unashamed. They're running around naked doing their thing in the garden. It's beautiful unity with the Father. And they're given one job. I think I have 30,000 things, but I know if I was given that one thing, I would have messed up too. They're given one thing not to do, and they still eat from the tree. And immediately this ripple is created throughout human history, a ripple of humanity unable to align themselves with the character and will of God until we arrive at another garden where Jesus feels the pressure and temptation to move away from the will of God just as Adam and Eve did. That's why Paul calls him the second Adam in Corinthians. He is the fulfiller of something that humanity could never fulfill. Jesus and His obedience creates an opportunity for righteousness that humanity in their disobedience created sinfulness. He is the one accomplisher of the thing that we failed at. He gets to fulfill this beautiful depiction of obedience to God. And there's a juxtaposition there. Humanity on its own cannot ever, period, align itself with the will of God. It cannot on its own put itself in line with the will of God. Jesus did it. So instead of relying on our own physical ability, which we know can never happen, we're invited into this new life that says, Jesus did it. What does that do for me? And so how does that look? What does that change in our lives? Because right now, even on this side of the cross, I still feel immense pressure. I still feel a crushing Gethsemane in my life. Whether it's pressure to live up to God's expectations for me, pressure to act in a manner that my position calls me to, pressure to be better at the roles God has placed me in as a spouse, sibling, parent, child, pressure to simply not want to, pressure that says, I want my way in this thing, pressure crushes us. And the hardest truth of this passage, the hardest truth of what we see in Christ here, is that the pressure doesn't necessarily go away because we obey. Christ obeyed and he still faced what he had to face. See, God does not say that obedience is the ticket to our freedom. And honestly, reflecting on that, I'm kind of glad he doesn't. Because if he did, that would mean that if I feel suffering, I'm not obeying well enough. And I need to work harder at it. Instead, no, what he says is a threefold promise to us. It's not a promise to be rid of difficulty, but it's a threefold promise. The first part of that is that Jesus experienced that same pressure that we feel fully for all of humanity, exponentially more than we ever can. Jesus felt it. The writer of Hebrews talks about it. He says, therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Jesus was there and he walked in it and he felt crushing pressure that drew him to the ground and made him sweat blood. Jesus was there. That's the first part of the promise. The second part of the promise is that Jesus faced it and conquered it fully. 1 Peter 2:24 says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed. Jesus conquered that pressure that drove him to his face into the ground. Jesus conquered it in that moment through obedience. And the third part of this promise, and it's the crux of everything that we sit here for, it's the crux of what allows us to be here, it's that we're gifted with a new nature that is fueled by Christ's Spirit. See, that same Spirit that enabled Christ to obey and enabled him to rise from the dead resides within us. Paul talks about it in Romans 8. That same Spirit is within us. So no longer do I have to worry about not falling asleep. No longer do I have to worry about not relying on Christ's strength. I don't have to rely on myself, but I instead get to rely on a man who's done it and on a man who's conquered it. I get to rely on his Spirit because it resides within me. So I can now obey from a new nature that is fused with Christ, one that is cherished and loved by our Father, and one that enables us to align ourselves with his will. So we can watch and pray, not rely on our physical ability. The weight was borne by Christ so that I don't have to bear it. So what does that look like? See, I racked my brain trying to come up and flip through Scripture, trying to come up with ways that this can be practiced, ways that this can be lived out, because that pressure's still there. And then I look back at this very passage, and it's right here. It's displayed by Christ completely. It looks like me going to my Father, face down in the ground, and saying, God, this is where I am. This is what I feel. This is what the pressure of this life is doing to me. And I still desire your will in the midst of that. And why? Why do we desire his will? The motivation for this is the love that he poured out in the garden, and the love that we know he poured out on the cross, and the love that we know conquered the grave afterward. Love is our motivation here. I know I would fall asleep if I were left to my own devices, but I'm not. I'm filled with your Spirit, and in knowing your love, I get to choose to love you in obedience. So it looks like being completely honest, completely open, completely on our face in our pressure. It looks like in whatever our Gethsemane is, allowing ourselves to be known fully by God, inviting him into those pressures, and choosing to say, I desire your will in these things all the same. I desire you to move in me. I desire you above all else, because I know the love that brought you to your face, and I know the love that nailed you to a cross, and I know the love that raised you from the dead. That's the new nature we're empowered with. So I desire to love Christ because he first loved me.
Same power that rose Jesus from the grave. Same